The fourth time Sergeant Lafayette Pool's tank was knocked out from under him, he was on fire before he knew he had been hit. That is how it works with an armor-piercing round at close range. The round travels faster than the sound it makes. The first thing a tank crew knows is the impact, not the warning. And by the time the brain has processed the impact, the interior of the tank is already doing what the interior of a tank does when a high-velocity projectile has punched through the armor and released its energy inside a steel box full of fuel and ammunition and men. Pool was out of the hatch in seconds. He had practiced this. He had practiced it because 3 previous tanks had given him the specific and irreplaceable education of a man who has been inside a burning armored vehicle and gotten out and understood with his entire body what the difference between fast and not fast enough actually means. He was fast. He was out. He was on the ground in the field outside Ligny-Sainville in France on a morning in August of 1944, with his crew around him and the tank burning behind him. And he looked at the burning tank for a moment, and then he looked at his crew and counted them. All 5 were out. He said, "Let's go find another one." This was not bravado. This was not the performed courage of a man constructing a story about himself. This was a man who had decided something, at some point between the first tank and the fourth tank, that the decision had been made and did not need to be remade every time a new tank burned. The decision was that he was going to keep doing the job until the job was done, or until something stopped him that was more final than a burning tank. Nothing that final had happened yet. Lafayette George Pool was born in 1920 in Oakhurst, Texas, which is a small town in East Texas in the pine forest country, where the land is different from the flat, open plains that most people picture when they picture Texas. He grew up in a family that had been in that part of Texas for 2 generations, his grandfather having come down from Arkansas after the Civil War, and settled in the timber country where a man with a strong back and a willingness to work could make something that lasted. His father worked in the timber industry. His uncles worked in the timber industry. Lafayette Pool grew up understanding that work was physical, and that physical work was what men did, which was not a complicated philosophy, but was a functional one. He was mechanically gifted in the way that some people are musically gifted, not as something learned, but as something native, a relationship with machines that was intuitive rather than acquired. By the time he was in his teens, he could diagnose an engine problem by sound, the way a doctor diagnoses a heart condition by listening, through an attention that had been calibrated by enough exposure to know what right sounded like, and therefore to recognize what wrong sounded like. He worked on farm equipment and trucks and anything else in the county that needed working on, and the people who brought him their machines knew that he would find what was wrong and fix it, and that the fixing would hold. He was 21 years old when Pearl Harbor happened. He enlisted in the Army in January of 1942 and was assigned to armor because the Army's classification system identified men with mechanical aptitude and put them where mechanical aptitude was most useful, which in 1942 was in the expanding armored force that was being built to fight a war on terrain where tanks would matter. He trained on the M4 Sherman, which was the tank that the United States Army was going to fight the war with, and he learned it with the thoroughness that his mechanical instinct made natural. The Sherman was not the most powerful tank in the world in 1942. It was not going to be the most powerful tank in the world in 1944 when Pool was fighting in it. The Germans had the Panther and the Tiger, both of which could kill a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman's main gun could not reliably kill them. And the men who trained on Shermans and were going to fight in Shermans knew this, or learned it quickly once they arrived in a theater where German armor was present. Pool knew it. He was not confused about the Sherman's limitations or the comparative capabilities of the armor he was going to be fighting against. His mechanical understanding of what the Sherman was and what it was not was clear and accurate, and did not require him to pretend the tank was something it was not in order to be willing to fight in it. He was willing to fight in it because it was what he had and because the job required it. And those two reasons were sufficient. He deployed to England with the 2nd Armored Division in the spring of 1944. Part of the enormous buildup of American forces that was the infrastructure of the invasion that everyone knew was coming, and nobody outside the highest command levels knew when. He trained in England through the spring, running exercises across the English countryside, learning the specific operational rhythms of armored warfare in the European context, which was different from the desert warfare in North Africa and the mountain warfare in Italy, and required its own adaptations. He crossed the Channel in July of 1944, coming ashore at Normandy in the weeks after D-Day when the beachhead had been secured, but the breakout from the hedgerow country was still being fought for, and he drove his Sherman inland into terrain that the planners had known would be difficult and that turned out to be exactly as difficult as they had known, and worse in some respects that the planning had not fully captured. The first tank went in the hedgerow country in July. A Panzerfaust, the German single-shot anti-tank rocket that a single infantryman could carry and fire from cover, hit the tank at close range in a narrow lane between two hedgerows, where the vegetation on both sides was dense enough to conceal a man completely. The round came through the front armor. Pool had the hatch open, which saved him, because the instinct to keep the hatch cracked in hedgerow country was the instinct of a man who had been briefed on what happened inside a closed tank when a Panzerfaust came through the hull. He was out before the fuel caught. His crew was out. The tank was not salvageable. He requested a replacement and received one within 48 hours, which was the operational tempo of the American armored forces in Normandy in the summer of 1944, where the supply system was producing replacement tanks faster than combat was destroying them, which was one of the structural advantages that no amount of German tactical skill could fully compensate for. The second tank went in late July, during the breakout that followed Operation Cobra, the American offensive that finally cracked the German defensive line and opened the way for the rapid advance across France that Patton's Third Army turned into one of the most dramatic armored thrusts in military history. Pool's unit was part of that thrust. The second tank was hit by a German anti-tank gun in a firefight near the town of Avranches, the engagement that opened the gate through which the Third Army poured into the French interior. The round came through the side armor. Pool was out. His crew was out. The gunner had a fragment wound in his left arm that the medic dressed on the road, while Pool was already talking to his company commander about the next tank. The company commander was a man named Captain Walter Dunlap of Georgia, who had been commanding armor since North Africa, and who had developed the particular quality of professional equanimity that experienced armored officers develop when they have seen enough tanks burn to understand that the burning is part of the operational reality and not the exception to it. Dunlap looked at Pool standing by the road while his gunner was being bandaged and said, "How many does that make?" Pool said, "2." Dunlap said, "You're keeping count." Pool said, "Seems useful." Dunlap found him a replacement tank. The third tank went in August, in the drive across France that followed the breakout, when the Third Army was moving so fast that the supply lines were struggling to keep pace, and the armored units at the front were sometimes running on the fuel they had captured from German depots rather than fuel that had come up from the beaches. The operational tempo was extraordinary. Units that had spent years training for a war in which movement was measured in miles per week were moving in miles per hour, and the German forces in front of them were retreating or surrendering, or being bypassed and left for the infantry following behind. Pool's tank was in the lead of a column moving through a French village when a German Panther that had been positioned behind a building came around the corner at close range, close enough that neither tank had time to bring its main gun to bear properly, and the engagement that followed was the kind of close-quarters armor fight that training exercises simulated but could not replicate. Two steel vehicles trying to maneuver in a space designed for farm carts, with infantry scrambling in all directions around them. The Panther's 75mm gun got the angle first. The round went through the Sherman's turret. The loader was killed. Pool and the remaining crew were out before the ammunition cooked off. Pool was unhurt. This was a fact that his company, his battalion, and eventually his regiment found increasingly remarkable as the summer progressed. Not merely that he had survived 3 knocked-out tanks, which was unusual but not unprecedented, but that he had survived 3 knocked-out tanks and appeared to have processed each one as primarily a logistical problem, the problem of acquiring a replacement tank and continuing the mission, rather than as an experience that accumulated towards something. The accumulation was there. Pool was not a man who did not feel things. He was a man who had made a decision about what to do with the feeling, which was the same decision that Francis Carey had described to Dorothy Barr in the field hospital in Normandy on that first afternoon, though Pool and Carey never met and arrived at the same understanding entirely independently. Feel it later. The job first. Later is for the feeling. He requested a replacement after the 3rd tank. He received one. He named it In the Mood, which was the title of the Glenn Miller song that had been playing on the radio at a dance he had attended in England the spring before the invasion. Not for any particular reason except that the name amused him, and amusement was a resource he had learned to cultivate. In the Mood was the tank that was burning behind him on the morning in August outside Lignières-Saunville when he stood in the field and counted his crew and said, "Let's go find another one." What Lafayette Pool did between July and September of 1944, in the tank and the 2 tanks before it, and the tank that replaced the one that burned at Lignières-Saunville, is documented in the unit records of the 3rd Armored Division, with the specificity that military record-keeping provides when the actions being recorded are exceptional enough to require documentation beyond the standard operational log. He destroyed 12 German tanks. The specific types are recorded: 4 Panzer IVs, 3 Panthers, 2 Stug 3s assault guns, 2 Panzer IIIs, and 1 Tiger I, which is significant because the Tiger was the tank that American armored units feared most, the tank whose armor the Sherman's standard 75mm gun could not reliably penetrate from the front at any practical combat range. The tank that required either a flank shot or a shot from the new 76mm gun that was beginning to appear on late-model Shermans. Pool had a 76mm by September. He used it. He destroyed 28 German artillery pieces. He destroyed more than 250 other vehicles, half-tracks and trucks and staff cars, and the motorized equipment that an army in motion requires to remain an army. He did this over a period of approximately 2 months, moving through France with the 3rd Army at the pace of Patton's advance, which was the fastest sustained armored advance in the war to that point. The men who fought alongside him describe a specific quality that accounts like this tend to flatten into the word aggressive, but that the testimony of witnesses makes more precise. Pool was not reckless. Reckless implies a disregard for consequences. Pool was a man who had experienced the consequences of armored combat 3 times at close range, and who had made a calculation about risk that was different from the calculation most men made. Not because the consequences seemed smaller to him, but because the mission seemed larger. The mission was to keep moving, to keep the pressure on, to prevent the German forces from establishing the defensive lines that would cost infantry lives to crack. An armored unit that slowed down gave the Germans time to organize. An armored unit that kept moving made organization impossible. Pool kept moving. There is a specific type of effectiveness that combat produces in people who have found the thing they are most capable of and are doing it under the conditions that require it most. Thomas Ferris had found it in the toolbox under the radio operator's station. Dorothy Barr had found it in the ward section of the field hospital. Pool found it in the turret of a Sherman tank with the hatch open and the German lines in front of him. And what it looked like from the outside was a man doing something very dangerous with a quality of complete attention that left no room for the hesitation that danger normally produces. His crew trusted him with the specific trust that comes from following a man into situations that should have killed everyone and watching him bring everyone out. The trust was not blind. It was the trust of men who had evaluated the evidence and concluded that the man they were following had a quality that improved their survival odds, and that the quality was worth following into the situations that produced the evidence. His driver, a man from Ohio named Corporal James Dew, who had been with Pool since England and had been in 3 of the 4 knocked-out tanks, was offered a transfer after the second tank and declined it. He said later that he was safer with Pool than he would have been with anyone else, because Pool knew exactly what he was doing and most people did not. This is the paradox that Lafayette Pool represents. The man who had the most reason to be afraid of tanks, who had been inside 4 burning ones and had the specific bodily knowledge of what that experience contained, was the man who was most willing to go back into a 5th one, and a 6th one, and however many came after. Not because the fear was absent, because the fear had been processed into information, the same thing Pool had done with every engine he had ever diagnosed. Turned into data about the system rather than a response to the system. And the data was useful, but it was not controlling. The fear told him, this tank can be killed. He already knew that. He had known it 4 times. What the fear did not tell him was whether to stop. That was a different question, and he had already answered it. The 5th tank, the one he named In the Mood's replacement after Lignières-Sonville, he named Ends and Odds, which was not a phrase with an obvious meaning, but which his crew accepted without question because by September of 1944, Pool's crew had learned that the names meant something to him that he did not explain, and that the meaning was his business. Ends and Odds was the tank he was commanding on the 6th of September 1944, near the town of Pufendorf in Germany, when Lafayette Pool was finally stopped. The engagement was a standard armored advance against prepared German positions, the kind of fighting that the Third Army had been doing since the breakout, pushing against a German defensive line that was trying to slow the Allied advance long enough for the German High Command to organize something more substantial. Pool's tank was in the lead, which it usually was, because Pool understood that the lead tank in an armored column had the initiative and the surprise, and that the cost of giving up the lead was giving up those advantages, and the advantages were worth the exposure. The anti-tank round that hit Ends and Odds came from a position that Pool had not yet located. It came through the lower hull. It wounded Pool severely in both legs, taking one below the knee and damaging the other with fragment wounds that required immediate surgery. His crew got him out. The crew was intact. Pool was not. He was evacuated to a field hospital, and from there to a base hospital in England. And the medical record that follows him from Germany to England to eventual repatriation to the United States is the record of a man with wounds serious enough that his return to combat was not a question that required discussion. He was done. Not because he decided to stop, because the 5th tank had finally extracted the cost that the previous 4 had not. He lost the lower part of his right leg. The left leg healed. The surgeries were multiple and extended over several months. He was in hospitals in England and in the United States through the winter of 1944 and the spring of 1945. And the war ended in Europe in May while he was still in a hospital in the United States, which meant that he did not see the end of the thing he had been fighting since Normandy, except as a news report in a hospital ward. He received the Silver Star. He received the Bronze Star with multiple oak leaf clusters. He received the Purple Heart. The citation for the Silver Star describes his actions in terms that military citation language uses, which is precise but compressed, covering in 3 sentences events that took months and that the men who were present describe in much more particular terms when interviewed. The 3rd Armored Division's after-action reports for the summer and autumn of 1944 contain multiple references to Pool's unit and Pool's actions. And the accumulation of those references creates a picture of a man operating at a level of consistent effectiveness that the reports note with the understated appreciation of military documents that are designed to record facts rather than express admiration. One report, covering the action at Pfullendorf, contains a notation that has been cited in several subsequent accounts of Pool's service. It notes that at the time of his wounding, Pool's vehicle had been in more direct engagements with enemy armor than any other vehicle in the division, and that his crew had the highest confirmed armor kill count in the Third Army for the period covered. What the report does not contain, because military after-action reports do not contain this kind of information, is anything about what it cost him. Not the leg. The leg is in the medical record. The cost that the reports do not contain is the specific weight of being the man who had been through what Pool had been through and had decided each time to go back, and what that decision accumulated into over the months between the first tank in the hedgerows and the last tank at Pfullendorf. Pool came home to Texas in the spring of 1945, before the war in Europe ended. He came home on crutches and then on a prosthetic leg. And he came home to Oakhurst, which was the same small town in the pine forest country where he had grown up, and which had not changed in the ways that mattered while he was gone. The trees were the same. The people were the same, older, some of them with their own losses from the war, but the same in the way that small towns are the same across the intervals that change everything else. He went back to work on machinery. This was not remarkable. It was what he knew how to do, and what the county needed done, and what gave shape to the days in the way that work gives shape to days for people who understand that the shape is important. He worked on farm equipment and trucks. He adapted to the prosthetic with the practicality of a man who had adapted to 4 burning tanks, and who understood that adaptation was a skill rather than a virtue, something you did because the alternative was not adaptive. He did not talk much about the war. This was not unusual. The men who came home from the European theater in 1945 mostly did not talk much about the war. Not because they were hiding it, but because the talking required a translation that was difficult, and because the people asking the questions mostly did not have the context that would make the answers meaningful. Pool had the additional specific situation of a man whose experience was so far outside the ordinary range of combat experience that even other veterans sometimes found it difficult to locate within their own frames of reference. 4 tanks, 12 enemy tanks destroyed, a leg. He married a woman named Doris in 1946. They had children. The life that followed was full and ordinary in the way that the lives of men from that generation were full and ordinary after the war. The extraordinary things they had done compressed by time and the forward pressure of living into something that was present but not prominent. There in the background, the way the pine forest was in the background of Oakhurst, always present, not always in the foreground. His son found a box of his father's military papers in the 1970s. The citations and the records, and a small number of photographs, some of them showing tanks that Pool identified by name when his son brought the photographs to him. His son asked him about the names. Pool said the names were just names. His son asked which one was in the mood. Pool pointed to it without expression. His son asked what it was like to be in a tank that was burning. Pool was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Hot." His son laughed because he thought his father was deflecting. He was not deflecting, he was being precise. The most immediate and overwhelming physical characteristic of being inside a burning tank is the heat, which is the heat of fuel burning in an enclosed steel space. And the precision of Pool's answer was the precision of a man who had been there and was describing what was actually there rather than what made a better story. His son asked him why he kept going back. Pool said, "The job wasn't finished." His son said, "4 times, though." Pool said, "It took 4 times. Would have been better if it had taken less." This is the answer of a man who had not constructed a story about himself that required the experience to be meaningful in a particular way. 4 tanks was not a narrative of heroism to Pool. It was a record of how many times the job had required what it required before the leg made the question academic. The number was a fact. The fact was not the point. The point was the job, and the job had been what it had been, and he had done it until he could not do it anymore. The 3rd Armored Division Veterans Association held reunions for decades after the war. Pool attended them. The men who had served with him and the men who had served in his unit and knew his reputation from the records spoke about him in the specific way that soldiers speak about other soldiers whose effectiveness they have witnessed, with an admiration that was professional before it was personal. The admiration of people who understand what a thing costs and have evaluated whether the man paying the cost was paying it well. He was paying it well. Lafayette Pool died in 1997 in Oakhurst, Texas, at the age of 76. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his service in World War II and his long career as a mechanic and his family. It mentioned the Silver Star. It did not come close to describing what the Silver Star had been awarded for, which is the universal characteristic of military decoration citations, that the words are never adequate to the events they describe. What the events describe is this: a man from the Texas Pine Country who understood machines the way some people understand music, who went to war in a tank that was outgunned by the tanks it was going to fight, who had 4 of those tanks destroyed under him, and each time came out of the burning vehicle and asked for another one. Not because he was not afraid, but because he had decided that the fear was information and not instruction, and who destroyed more German armor than any other tank commander in Patton's 3rd Army during the most successful sustained armored advance in American military history, and who came home and fixed farm equipment in East Texas and named his tanks things that meant something to him that he never explained, and who answered his son's question about what it was like to burn with one word: hot. That was the whole of it. The precision of a man who had been there and knew exactly what it was and did not need it to be more than what it was, because what it was enough, more than enough. The kind of enough that a man carries quietly in a small town in East Texas for 50 years and never makes more of than it was, which is the rarest and most complete form of understanding a man can have of the thing that defined him. If this story changed how you think about what courage actually looks like when you strip away everything theatrical about it, please like and subscribe. The men who fought in the armor of the 3rd Army in the summer of 1944 paid a price that the records capture and that the records cannot fully contain. Thank you for watching. There is a specific thing that happens to a man who has been inside a burning tank and gotten out and been handed another one. It is not the thing that happens to a man who has been in a dangerous situation once and survived and must now decide whether to go back. That decision, the first one, is made with incomplete information. The man who has not yet been inside a burning tank is making a decision about something he has not experienced, and the gap between the imagined experience and the actual experience is wide enough that the decision made before the experience and the decision made after it are essentially different decisions made by essentially different people. Pool had been inside a burning tank. He had made the decision after the experience, with full information, which is a different kind of decision and a much harder one. The first time is fear of the unknown. The second time is fear of the known, which is worse, because the known has a specific content that the imagination fills with the correct details rather than the incorrect ones. He made the decision 4 times. The 5th time, the decision was made for him by the round that came through the lower hull at Pufendorf, which is a kind of answer to the question of when he would have stopped if the stopping had been left to him. The answer, based on the evidence, is that he would not have stopped on his own, which is not the same as saying he was trying to die. It is saying that his relationship with the decision was stable in a way that external events could disrupt, but that his own volition was not going to disrupt, because the decision had been made and he was done remaking it. This quality, The stability of a decision that has been made completely and does not require remaking is different from the quality that people usually mean when they use words like fearless or brave. Fearless implies the absence of fear. Poole was not fearless. The testimony of the men who served with him makes clear that he was a man who experienced fear the way anyone experienced it, as a physical response to physical danger, and that the physical response was present in the situations that produced it. He did not pretend otherwise. He did not perform the absence of fear. He simply did not allow the fear to constitute an argument. His gunner, a man named Corporal Raymond Mason of Virginia, who had been with Poole from the 2nd Tank onward and who gave an interview to a Veterans History Project in the 1980s, described what it was like to serve in Poole's tank. He said, "He never asked us to do anything he wasn't doing himself. He was in the same tank we were in." That sounds simple, but it wasn't simple. A lot of commanders managed from behind. Poole managed from in front. That changes everything about how you feel about what you're being asked to do. Mason was asked if he was afraid. He said, "Every day." He was asked if Poole was afraid. He said, "I think so. He just didn't act like it mattered." It mattered. The evidence that it mattered is in the precision and the judgment and the decision-making that Poole demonstrated across the summer. Because a man who genuinely felt no fear would have made different decisions than Poole made. Fear is information about danger, and correct information about danger, processed correctly, produces better tactical decisions than the absence of that information. Poole was an excellent tactician. His record demonstrates this. The pattern of his engagements, the way he used terrain and timing, and the specific capabilities of his tank against the specific capabilities of the tanks opposing him, reflects the tactical judgment of a man who was processing all available information, including the information that danger was present and that the danger was real, and that the margin between survival and not survival was smaller than anyone on either side would have preferred. He processed the fear. He made the decisions. He kept moving. The Third Army's advance across France in the summer of 1944 is remembered as one of the signature achievements of American arms in the Second World War. The sweep from the Normandy breakout through the Loire Valley and across to the German border that happened so fast that even the men executing it sometimes could not locate themselves precisely on the maps they carried. Patton had designed the advance around the assumption that speed was armor, that an armored force moving faster than the enemy could organize against it was protected by its own momentum in a way that a stationary or slow-moving force was not. The theory was correct. The advance demonstrated it. Poole was one of the instruments of that demonstration, not the only one. The Third Army was full of men who were doing extraordinary things in extraordinary circumstances, with the systematic effectiveness of people who had been well trained and were well led, and were facing an opponent who was being pushed past the point where his remaining capabilities could compensate for his deteriorating situation. But Poole was among the instruments, and he was among the most effective, and the effectiveness was documented. The documentation is in the records and the citations and the after-action reports that survive in archives. It is also in the testimony of the men who were there, which is a different kind of documentation, but not a less reliable one, because the men who were there had information that the official records did not capture, and that the official records were not designed to capture. What those men describe is a tank commander who made his crew feel that the danger was manageable, not because he minimized the danger, but because he maximized the competence brought to it. There is a specific comfort that comes from being in a dangerous situation with someone who clearly knows exactly what they are doing. And that comfort is not irrational. It is the correct response to the evidence. Poole knew what he was doing. The men who rode with him knew that he knew it. The knowing was not a guarantee. Nothing was a guarantee in a Sherman tank in France in 1944. But the knowing improved the odds, and the men who rode with Pool knew that the odds were as good as they were going to get. Corporal James Dew, the driver who had declined the transfer after the second tank, was asked decades later why he had stayed with Pool when he had the opportunity to leave. He said, "I had watched him in 2 tanks already. I had watched him make decisions under fire that I could not have made myself. I trusted his judgment more than I trusted anyone else's. If I was going to be in a tank in France in 1944, I wanted to be in Pool's tank." He was asked, even knowing that Pool had already been in 2 tanks that burned. He said, especially knowing that. It meant he had been through it and come out and gone back. That told me something about who he was. I wanted to be with someone who had been through it and come out and gone back. This is the specific quality that Lafayette Pool represented to the men around him. Not that he was invulnerable. Not that his tanks did not burn. They did burn. 4 of them burned. The quality was that the burning had not changed him in the direction that burning usually changes people, which is toward the preservation of the self at the expense of the mission. Pool had been burned 4 times, and the burning had changed him in the other direction, toward the mission at the expense of whatever the self wanted to protect. And the men who rode with him understood that this quality was what they needed in the place they were and the time they were in it. He came home with 1 leg and the record and the small number of photographs and the names of the tanks that meant something he never explained. He came home to the pine forest country and the farm equipment and the ordinary life that followed. He did not make much of what he had done, which was characteristic of the generation that did it, the generation that understood the doing as the point and the recognition as beside the point. The generation that went away and came back and picked up where things had been left and kept going, which was a form of courage that did not require burning tanks to demonstrate, but that demonstrated it anyway when the burning tanks were what the time required. The names he gave his tanks are recorded. In the Mood, Ends, and Odds. The others he named through the summer are in the unit records. What the names meant is not recorded, because Pool did not explain them, and the not explaining was part of the same quality as the deciding and the going back and the hot. The quality of a man who knew exactly what things were and did not need them to be more than what they were, or explained in ways that expanded their size beyond their actual dimensions. The tanks were tanks. The war was the war. The job was the job. He did the job. That is what the record says, and the record is correct. And the correctness of the record does not diminish the thing it describes, which was a man from Texas in a steel box on fire 4 times who each time got out and asked for another one. Because the job was not finished, and he was the man who knew how to do it, and everything else was just details.